Our scripture lesson for today comes from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 14, verses 22 through 32. Immediately, he made the disciples get into a boat and go on ahead to the other side, while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But by this time, the boat, battered by the waves, was far from the land, for the wind was against them. And early in the morning he came, walking toward them on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, "It is a ghost!" And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat and started walking on the water and came toward Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind ceased. Well, friends, it was almost a year ago that we started planning for this weekend and next weekend. Next weekend, Plymouth will celebrate 30 years of being an open and affirming congregation. In preparation for next weekend, I was compelled that listening to the Reverend Dr. Paula Stone Williams would be a remarkable way for us to prepare our hearts and minds for what's just around the corner. Now, frankly, I wasn't sure if booking Paula was within the realm of possibility. As I shared in the Plymouth Magazine article, Paula did have to check with a commitment with Oprah before finalizing her plans to be with us today. It's true that Paula has a large following in light of her viral TED Talks and best-selling book, As a Woman, What I Learned About Power, Sex, and Patriarchy After I Transitioned, published by Simon & Schuster in 2021. As a fun tidbit, Paula also wrote the foreword to Family of Origin, Family of Choice, our current all-church reads. I invited Paula to Plymouth not because she's well-known, but because I trust that she can speak a faithful word that will meet this congregation where we are. It was a few weeks ago that one of our members approached me in the hallway after a Sunday service. She mentioned how she's long followed Paula and how meaningful Paula's story has personally been to her. She went on to name how grateful she was for having a chance to hear from Paula right here at Plymouth. I was moved by this hallway exchange, and I look forward to being moved by Paula's words for us in the sermon, as well as in the all-church lunch right after this service. Please give a warm Plymouth welcome to the Reverend Dr. Paula Stone Williams.
Mary Oliver, sweet Jesus, talking his melancholy madness, stood up in the boat, and the sea lay down, silky and sorry. So everybody lived that night. But you know how it is when something different crosses the threshold. The uncles mutter together. The women walk away. The young brother begins to sharpen his knife. Nobody knows what the soul is. Comes and goes like the wind over the water, sometimes for days you don't think of it. Maybe after the storm, after the multitude was fed, one or two of them felt the soul slip forth like a tremor of pure sunlight before exhaustion that wants to swallow everything, gripped their bones and left them, miserable and sleepy as they are now, forgetting how the wind tore through the sails as he rose and spoke to it. Tender, luminous, demanding, as he always was, as he always is. 1,000 times more frightening than the killer sea. It's 4th chapter of the Gospel of Mark. Jesus had just completed 8 mini parables. He was ready to head back across the Sea of Galilee. He got in the back of the boat. The disciples got in the front of the boat. They headed across the sea, and a terrible storm kicked up just like that, which, as I understand it, is actually not all that unusual on the Sea of Galilee. Only this storm was worse than usual. The waves were crashing against the bow of the boat. The wind was whistling through the boat. The disciples thought, well, now, this is it. We're going to die right here in the middle of the Sea of Galilee. And they looked to the back of the boat, and there was Jesus, sound asleep. Don't you just hate it when someone has the capacity to be utterly and completely calm in the midst of what you are personally convinced are dire circumstances? It's a little over a decade ago. I was headed with a friend of mine off the coast of Long Island, New York, where I lived at the time. We were in our kayaks. We were going across the Great South Bay to a quiet area on the other side. It was late November, but a really warm day. We got about 100 yards from the other side, and we both got hit by a trailing wave, which flipped our kayaks over just like that. And we had very, very stable kayaks, which meant once they go over, you're not flipping them back up. And so your only option is to do what they call a wet exit. You have to pull up on the spray skirt, push yourself out of the kayak like you're taking off a pair of pants, and you have to do all of this while you are upside down underwater. And did I mention it was late November? And we hadn't worn our wetsuits. That water was so cold. I was I came up to the surface just flapping my arms. We're going to die. We got to get to shore. And my friend said, hey, stand up. Oh, yeah, water was about 4.5 feet deep, It's kind of pulled the kayak back to shore. It was a little embarrassing. That's what's going on here. The disciples are terrified for their lives. Jesus sound asleep in the back of the boat. They wake him up, not because they think he can do anything, but because they're desperate for any kind of help at this point. And he says, "Oh, you of little faith." And then he says to the storm just 3 words. He says, "Quiet, be still." I can say that all day long to my 5 granddaughters. Nothing ever happens. Jesus says it one time to the storm, and the storm just stopped. Imagine you're out there in the middle of this raging storm. Jesus speaks 3 words, and the storm just stopped. Now, if at first they were terrified of the storm, now the disciples have discovered a far more compelling reason to be terrified. Now they're terrified of this man, Jesus. Who is this man? With a few simple words, he can calm a raging storm. I know how they felt about Jesus. They were drawn to him, frightened of him, all at the same time. C.S. Lewis understood that in his Chronicles of Narnia, a series of books. Aslan the lion is, of course, the hero of the books, and the children are very taken by Aslan because he's a savior. At the same time, they're frightened of him because he's a lion. And if he wanted to, he could tear them limb from limb. And I love it because Lewis says through all 7 books, Aslan was not a safe lion, Good, but not safe. And so now the disciples were discovering that Jesus was anything but a safe Lord. And I think this really is the point for them where life began. I think everything up to this time you could call, once before a time. This is their once upon a time. This is when the once upon a time began. When they came to the realization that life ultimately is terrifying. The question isn't whether it's terrifying or not. The question is, what do you do in the face of life's terror? The storm or Jesus? What do you do in the face of life's terror? What do they do then? We don't know. We have to go to our next boat story to find an answer to that question. 14th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew. Jesus has just rejected the plea to be the new political king of Israel, went up into the mountains alone, told the 12 to go back down and cross the Sea of Galilee. You can see them shuffling back to the seaside. Well, the time is so perfect for him to proclaim himself king, but no. They get back to the seashore, look at the boat, look at the water, look at the boat. Deja vu sets in. Oh, we've done this before. But they follow his instruction. They head across the Sea of Galilee, and sure enough, halfway off, A terrible storm kicks up. Only this time, there's no Jesus sound asleep in the back of the boat. And to make matters worse, they look out on the water and a ghost is walking toward them. The ghost speaks. He says, "Take courage, it is I." Interesting word, courage. I always thought to be courageous meant to step forward without any fear whatsoever, but finally it occurred to me, that's not courage, that's stupidity. No, courage is stepping forward even though you know you are absolutely filled with fear. And Peter, rather courageously, thought he'd heard that ghost before. So he said, "Lord, if that's you, tell me to walk to you on the water." And so Peter said, okay. Or Jesus said, "Okay, walk to me in the water." So Peter got out of the boat and he walked on the water. I've never done that. Have you ever done that? I don't know anybody who's ever done that. No, actually, that's not correct. When I was a kid, I used to go to a church camp in northern Ohio and a big lake there, and one night they were doing a Bible reenactment of this story, and they had a floating dock in the swimming area. It's really, really cool. They put just enough ballast in the tanks of that dock to bring it right down to water level, and it really looked like Jesus was walking in the water. Problem was, Jesus couldn't tell where the edge of the dock was, and fell into the water, and it turned out Jesus did not swim all that well, which, so the disciples had to come in the boat and save him. It just kind of ruined the impact of the whole thing. Did the rest of the disciples get out of the boat to walk in the water? No. The only one with the courage to get out of the boat and walk in the water was Peter. Oh, I know, he took his eyes off Jesus, cried, "Lord, save me." That's not the important point. The important point is that he had the courage to get out of the boat and walk in the water in the first place. So I knew from the time I was 4 or 5 years of age I was transgender. In my naivete, and I think also my white male entitlement, I thought I got to choose. I thought a gender fairy would arrive and say, "Okay, what's it going to be?" But alas, no gender fairy arrived, so I just lived my life. I didn't hate being a boy, I just knew I wasn't one. Went to college, got married, had kids, built a career, but the call toward authenticity has all the subtlety of a smoke alarm. And eventually decisions have to be made, and so I came out as transgender and promptly lost every single one of my jobs. I had never had a bad review, and within 24 hours, I lost every single job. In all 50 states of the United States, you cannot be fired for being transgender, but in all 50, you can be fired if you are transgender and you work for a religious corporation. Good to know. It's not easy being a transgender woman. People often ask, "Do you feel 100% like a woman?" And I say, well, first of all, if you've talked to one transgender person, you've talked to exactly one transgender person. I'm not going to speak for anybody else. I feel 100% like a transgender woman. There are things a cisgender woman knows I will never know, but that said, I'm learning a lot about what it means to be a woman, and I'm learning a lot about my former gender. And I am here to tell you, oh my goodness, the differences, they are massive. Let's start with just the little stuff. The pockets on women's jeans. Could someone explain this to me? On my jeans as a guy, you could hold 2 cell phones and 3 hammers in there. This, and maybe a paper clip. I just don't get it. I bought a pair of jeggings. They have stitching there that makes you think there's a pocket, but oh no, there is no pocket there. It's all a trick. So about 3 years ago, I was able to speak for the headquarters at Levi's Corporation in San Francisco. I thought, this is it. Finally, I'm going to find out about the pockets on women's jeans. And so I asked them, I said, so someone tell me. And they said, oh yeah, it's just always been that way. Really? Well, just because it's always been that way doesn't mean it has to continue being that way. But no. Or the size of a woman's wardrobe. As a guy, I had a few pairs of jeans, a few pairs of khaki pants, a couple of blue sport coats. What do you need? As a woman, I have closets and closets full of clothes. Why? Because people will notice if you wear something too often. Well, actually, men won't notice because they're men. But women will notice, and they will judge you for it. Here's a phrase you will never hear spoken to a man. You'll never hear anybody say to a man, "Hey dude, that is not a good haircut for a man over 50. Because we don't care if a man looks like he's over 50 or 60 or 70 for that matter, but a woman, people say, "Who's your hairdresser?" As if to say, "Do you really even have a hairdresser? And if you do, does she know you're over 50? There's no way a well-educated white male can understand how much the culture is tilted in his favor. There's no way he can understand it because it's all he's ever known and all he ever will know. And conversely, there's no way for a woman to understand the full import of that because being a woman is all she's ever known. I mean, she might have an inkling that she's working twice as hard for 81% as much, but really she has no idea how much more difficult life is for her than it is for the guy in the Brooks Brothers jacket in the office across the hall. I know, I was that guy. And the truth is, I will not live long enough to lose my white male entitlement. I brought it with me when I transitioned. But that doesn't mean I do not see my power diminishing, and did not see it diminishing almost immediately after transitioning. It's brought onto the board of a large nonprofit. We had a large annual conference. We had a brand new CEO, and we were talking in a board meeting, do we want to have her give a keynote for the conference? And I said, well, she's not a seasoned speaker, and so maybe we'll just interview her. I'd be happy to do that, but if you want her to give a keynote, I would be happy to coach her. At which point a powerful white male in the room, happened to be a McKinsey partner actually, said, well, if we're going to do that, why don't we hire a real coach? So I waited to see if any of the women would speak up on my behalf because a lot of them knew my background, but no, they did not. That's one of the things I've discovered is women do not empower one another. That was a rude awakening. I can tell you what I wanted to say. What I wanted to say to the guy was, I've done 3 TED Talks that have had, 9 million views. I am a coach for the largest TEDx in North America. I'm a speaker's ambassador for TED. I've taught speech in 3 universities, 2 in the United States, 1 in Europe. Tell me what part of that does not make me a real coach? But instead I said nothing because I've learned as a woman, if you say something, well, now you're just that woman. If there's just one thing I could go back and say to Paul, it would be assume a woman knows what she's talking about and treat her accordingly. That all by itself would go a very long way. Well, that plus, please guys, just stop interrupting us, really, seriously, just stop interrupting us. Men interrupt women twice as often as they interrupt other men. Joseph Campbell called it the hero's journey. It's common to every culture, every age, every language, every ethnicity, every people group. An ordinary citizen is called on an extraordinary road of trials on the hero's journey. And initially, the ordinary citizen rejects the call onto the road of trials because, hey, it's the road of trials. Nobody ever willingly goes onto the road of trials. But now you've rejected the call. And you know what that feels like. Now you're miserable because you know you rejected the call. And so a spiritual guide comes into your life, a Yoda, if you will, who gives you the courage to answer the call onto the hero's journey. And sure enough, you get onto the road of trials, and it's a road of trials. And then it gets worse. You find yourself in a deep, dark cave. Dante, the beginning of the Commedia. In the middle of the road of my life, I awoke in a dark wood where the true way was wholly lost. Yeah, the deep, dark cave. Shakespeare's Macbeth, life is but a tale told by an idiot full of sound and fury signifying nothing. Yeah, that deep, dark cave, John of the Cross called it the dark night of the soul. And you are completely and utterly lost. And this is when you learn one of the most important lessons life has to give. You learn that it's all right to be lost because lost is a place too. That's right. Lost is a place too. And sometimes you got to spend some time in the place called lost, a day, a week, a month, a year. Nobody wants to have to spend time in the place called lost, but there's a certain kind of a wisdom you gain there you cannot gain any other way. Just ask Jacob. All of us we'll have to spend time in the place called lost. And if we learn the lessons we need to learn there, eventually we see the light at the end of the tunnel, and this time it's not an oncoming train. And we get back out onto the ordinary road of trials, which now feels like nothing compared to what we just went through. And then finally you get to the pearl of great price, to the Holy Grail, only now you're wise enough to realize that is not and never was the end of your journey. But now that you've gotten to the Holy Grail, it's your responsibility to take that gift, bring it back, and give it as an offering to those from whom you have departed. Only then are you free to go. Now here's the thing. All of us have been called onto the hero's journey, a lot of us more than once. The question is not whether or not you've been called on the hero's journey. The question is, are you willing to answer the call? Now, occasionally I'll meet people who say that, yes, I've been called. I just recently have been called. I am so excited about it. This is the call I've been waiting for my entire life. I was made for this. This is my call. Yeah, that's not your call. That's somebody else's call. Because your call is never received with great happiness. Your call will always be received as a moment of, you want me to what? Because the call will always be to a place that you don't think you have the tools to go. And the reason you don't think you have the tools to go is because you don't. You will gain them in the midst of the journey. I mean, even Beowulf didn't find the sword with which he slayed the mother of Grendel until he'd been in her lair 3 days and 3 nights. That's the way it works. You find the tools you need in the midst of the battle. Everybody's been called onto the hero's journey. Will you answer the call? So when I came out as transgender, I not only lost all of my jobs, I lost my pension, worth probably about $1 million. I also had loaned the ministry I was a part of $500,000, and they didn't want to give that back. I had to threaten a lawsuit just to get that back, which is a good thing, because over the next 48 months, I earned a total of $23,000, less than $6,000 a year. That was not easy. I've been a leader in our denomination, the 5th generation to be a part of that denomination in ministry, and I loved the work I did. I knew, 2,000 people by name. Post-transition, you know how many of those people I've had contact with in a substantive way? 6. Count them. 6. I was done with the church. Done. And then I felt God calling me back. Why? I could not turn loose of Jesus. And particularly the instruction he gave on his last day of public ministry, when in answer to the last public question he was ever asked, he said, just these 3 things. Love God, love your neighbor, and love yourself. Love the God who burst on the scene 14 billion years ago in all of God's complexity, mystery, and ever-expansiveness, rooted in relationship and grounded in love. That God, and yes, I just explained the Big Bang and more. Love your neighbor, particularly the ones who don't look like you. And you have to love yourself, because if you can't love yourself, you can't do the other 2. I knew I had been called back to the messiness of the church and its holiness, because the call toward authenticity is sacred and holy and for the greater good. And for the last 6 years, I've been the founding pastor of Vision Community Church in Boulder County, Colorado. My favorite David White poem is his poem, A Sweet Darkness, and it goes like this. When your eyes are tired, the world is tired also. When your vision has gone, no part of the world can find you. It's time to go into the dark, where the night has eyes to recognize its own. There you can be sure you are not beyond love. The dark will be your home tonight. The night will give you a horizon further than you can see. And then why I memorize this poem. You must learn one thing. You must learn one thing. You must learn one thing. The world was made to be free in. You must give up all the other worlds except the one to which you belong. Sometimes it takes darkness and the sweet confinement of your aloneness to learn that anything or anyone that does not bring you alive is too small for you. God, may we all have the courage to give up that to which we do not belong, and to run in the direction of that which gives us life, to the world that beckons us forward, to the call that is not too small for the great expansiveness of who you created us to be. This is my prayer in the name of Christ. Amen.